Well, greetings, amazing students, and welcome back to another lecture here for marginalized populations. Now, this week we'll be discussing another marginalized population in particular, and that is going to be serving individuals without citizenship. Now, in addition to discussing serving individuals who are not U.S. citizens here in the United States, we're also going to be discussing the topic of immigration in a broader sense. I'd like for us to consider that this week we'll be talking about immigration in the context of the United States, and I will be discussing relevant policies that have shifted over the years that have impacted immigration patterns and how we manage immigration here in the United States. But I'm also going to add a layer to our discussion. We're going to step back and we're going to examine immigration from a global phenomena, from a global perspective. So here at CBU, one of the four pillars for our institution is to adopt a global mindset. And so one of the things we'll do to prepare us to serve individuals without citizenship is to not only have a firm grasp of current policies or previous policies that have impacted immigration and expand our knowledge of immigration theories, but to also understand some of the statistics around global immigration patterns. And so I'm going to bring you this content today for the sake of seeking to deepen and broaden our knowledge of this topic of immigration, since we know that it can be a hot button topic right here in the US. But when we start to apply a global perspective to understanding immigration, we find that there's actually other countries throughout the world that are experiencing similar patterns of migration that are impacting their countries as well. And so that's the goal for today. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is go ahead and bring up our slides for today, and we will get started. Actually, let me pause here and restart so we get some good sound coming from here. All right, excellent. Here we are. And let me make some adjustments to the screen as well. So today, as discussed, our focus will be for our marginalized population on serving individuals without citizenship. Now, in order to do that, I'd like to discuss a couple of key immigration theories that are relevant to your future social work practice. When we think about immigration, we think about the topic of individuals leaving their country of origin and traveling to another country. And oftentimes we think about that as a pull effect, that individuals are drawn to the United States either for opportunities that are economic, religious freedom, whatever the case is, right? Freedom of lifestyle, and they move to the United States because they are pulled to it. But when we examine immigration theory, there's one piece to consider, and that is the push-pull phenomena. The push-pull phenomena recognizes that there are individuals who leave to come to the United States because they are drawn to the United States for the opportunities that we may be able to provide them. But there's also other dynamics at play. In the push-pull phenomena, we also recognize that individuals may be pushed from their countries of origins for various factors. So individuals can choose to leave their countries because of factors such as a lack of opportunities, discrimination against a particular group, maybe that's by ethnicity, race, religion, whatever the case is, or economic conditions that push them from their country of origin. Conversely, then they seek countries to migrate to that provide better opportunities, and they're pulled to countries like the United States. Now, oftentimes we tend to discuss immigration as discussing individual people who are moving or crossing the border, okay, for legal or illegal reasons or purposes. Now, it's important to consider as social workers, we are interested in examining the macro, meso, and micro factors that impact immigration patterns. So when we discuss the macro, what we're also interested in understanding, and that's why we're covering this in this lesson today, are the political, economic, cultural, and geographic forces that are at play, which may push or pull individuals from one country to the other. When we discuss meso factors, we're discussing the family or social networks, right? So sometimes we have immigrants where an individual may choose to leave their country, but they actually leave the family behind in their country of origin, right? So that would be a meso impact to immigration. And then what's most popularly discussed is the micro or individual choices based off of age, education, financial assets that someone may have in choosing or trying to determine whether migration is appropriate for them. One important statistic to keep in mind is that about only 2% of the world's population can afford to migrate. That's important for us to consider. Think about within your own family structure that if you chose to move from one country to the other, would you have the financial resources to purchase a home, find a job, maybe transportation, right? And support moving your entire family across the world to another country. When we look at finances in particular, only 2% of the world can actually afford to make that jump. This intensifies our discussion around migration because one of the things that we often discover is this push-pull phenomena is very much a factor for individuals who are moving from one country to the other, as well as for making the decision, can an individual choose to move under legal circumstances, or do they choose to attempt to cross the border illegally? Now, some more immigration theories that are important for us to understand is the melting pot theory. This is referred to as assimilation. And many of us are familiar with this term because it was very popular in the 80s and 90s and even 2000s to describe the United States as a melting pot. My own family on one side immigrated from Mexico to the United States in the 1950s, and the assumption was, one, that America was a melting pot, and two, that they would assimilate to US culture once they arrived to this country. So individuals under this notion or theory of immigration give up certain aspects of their national cultural origin in order to fit in with the culture of the new nation in which they are moving to. Another dynamic is the salad bowl theory, different from assimilation. This is referring to a term that we call acculturation. And I'm going to give you some examples, some visible examples of this in a second. So under the salad bowl theory of immigration, we recognize that there are times when newly arrived immigrants do not lose their unique aspects of their cultures, like in the melting pot model, but instead they retain them. So they adopt some of the practices, the norms, the cultural norms of the new country they are moving to, but they hold on to those same practices, norms from their country of origin. So let me give you some examples of what that looks like related to acculturation. Here in the United States, what we're starting to see is less of a salad bowl element where individuals come, just like a salad, you take multiple ingredients, you put them in, and then everything becomes one. It becomes one salad, right? As opposed to acculturation, this is where we are most often here in the United States. Individuals that are migrating to the United States are looking for the opportunities that are present in this country, but they're saying, I don't want to lose that culture, those values of my country of origin. So acculturation is a process, first off, to understand. There's really not an end point to it, but it's more of a spectrum that results from continuous contact between two different cultures, right? Two cultures, one, the country of origin, two, the country where individuals are immigrating from, and those two come together and they live in coexistence with one another. One culture, though, and this factor of acculturation is usually more dominant than the other, and sometimes we can adopt the superior inferior mindset as a result of it. So the other piece to consider is the less dominant culture typically makes the most changes to adapt to their environment. Think about that if you have families who have immigrated to the United States within your own networks, right? To consider that many of the times we may choose to favor, right, the dominant culture in which we are living in and still retain bits of our country or our culture of origin. Now, these changes include things like behaviors, values, cognition, meaning how we think, and they also affect behavior. Language proficiency in particular is one acculturation variable throughout the affect that affects special education placement and other factors. So consider this, is that, for example, when my grandparents immigrated from Mexico in the 1950s, the goal was not acculturation, rather it was assimilation, right? So this melting pot theory. The idea behind it when they immigrated in the 1950s was when you moved to the United States, you actually learned English, and you wanted to learn English to the point where you no longer had an accent, right, from your Spanish language. And so back in the 1950s, it could be, depending on where you were in the country, sort of a hostile environment for individuals immigrating from Mexico. In fact, you could be assaulted or discriminated against for speaking Spanish out in public. So in our household, we spoke Spanish within the household. My grandparents spoke Spanish to us, but they always emphasized that when you go out into public, you speak English and you don't want to develop the accent. That was part of the time of the immigration patterns, the expectation of our culture. But you look forward now into where we are today, many individuals say, I'm not so worried about keeping the accent. And in fact, I'm okay with speaking Spanish out in my natural environment. In fact, I very much want my children to learn to speak Spanish to retain the culture. This is a representation of the shift that is experienced here in the US as a result of some of these immigration theories. I want to give you a couple of examples of acculturation in a very practical sense. On the screen here, you see a photo, right, of a few individuals here in front of an amazing car. A little, looks like to be about a 67, 68 Chevy Impala. And I'd like to draw your attention to the street sign where my cursor is. If you notice, this picture was taken right here in Riverside. And this picture was generously provided to me by the community of Casablanca here in Riverside. Now, Casablanca is a community I had the opportunity with me and a couple of colleagues to engage in research on. Casablanca has a rich history. And here, Casablanca neighborhood starts right at the corner of Madison and Evans Street, just kind of near the In and Out, right? And the McDonald's and Home Depot over in Riverside, just right off of campus, really close. Casablanca in particular has a rich history of immigration patterns that have affected Southern California in particular. In fact, Casablanca is actually the second oldest Mexican barrio or neighborhood to exist in California, second only to Alvera Street in Los Angeles. And so in Casablanca, when individuals immigrated to the US, this picture was taken around the 1960s, mid to late 1960s, even the early 1970s. What we saw here were individuals that immigrated or their families immigrated from Mexico to the United States. The majority of individuals that were of Latino descent here in Casablanca came from Mexico at this time, though those demographics have shifted recently. We have a lot of other people from El Salvador, Guatemala, right, also moving to Casablanca now in Riverside. And so acculturation, what it meant was we were going to adopt some of the culture, right, of the United States, but we also needed to take care of one another. In this period of time, there was still remnants of segregation that existed between Latinos and white citizens in the United States. And as a result of that, people got together and they started to form their own cliques, or if you will, their own gangs, in order to protect themselves as well as to protect the neighborhoods they lived in, because they were vulnerable to attacks or other forms of discrimination or violence. And as a result, we started to see a forming right through cultural norms, languages that were spoken, food, and music, where individuals sort of banded together in order to support one another. In the photo here on the right-hand side, you'll see where it says V. Now, this is normal in terms of tagging or gang writing to V to represent barrio, and then you have CB here for Casablanca. So this was also sort of a sign, if you will, right, to individuals that are passing through the community, say, this is the Casablanca neighborhood. This is who we are. This was a perfect image of what acculturation looked like. Individuals moving to the United States from another country, adopting some of the norms of the US of having a car, having the Chevy, which was a dream for a lot of Americans, whether you were a citizen or not, but also creating sort of a flair, if you will, with a blend of your own culture, your own style of dress, your own style of modifying the car, right? Making it your own based off of your own culture's values. Another example here from Casablanca, right? Individuals related to acculturation. If you notice the cars in both of these photos, let me go back, this one and this one here are older than the time period based off of the dress than the individuals were when the picture was taken. What does that tell us about these photos? Well, it tells us that usually for individuals, families, communities who are in the process of acculturation, because they're still getting established here in the United States, money isn't something that's always easy to come by. Finding gainful employment, moving up in social mobility, moving into a salary range that can support a family, you're still in the process of doing that. So though you want to own a car, when you come to the United States, you may not be able to afford to own the newest car. You're owning these older cars, right, that are in the background. But in acculturation, many cultures across the world, when they immigrate to the United States, say, how do I fix up that car? How do I do something with it to give it its own flair, its personality, representative of our culture? This is where acculturation here in the United States also bloomed into another subculture of lowrider culture, right? This is where the notion, and let me show you this, over the history of acculturation rather than assimilation, was individuals holding on to some of the norms, adopting the norms of the dominant class within the context of the US, but doing so in a way that retained their own flair of their own culture of origin. And so here on the left, we see that in this time frame, this would be considered, right, what the dominant culture would wear in regards to business attire. The suits, the ties, notice the fit on the clothing on these gentlemen here. This was representative of dominant culture. What acculturation looked like was young Latinos coming up in the streets and they were saying to themselves, I want to wear the suit, right? I want to look sharp when I go out. I want to be professional and have that flair, but I want to do so in my own way. And so for those of you familiar with this style of dress, this is zoot suit culture, right? These were referred to as zoot suits. If you notice, we've still got the business jacket, we still have the slacks, we still have the dress shirt, but notice the fit, notice the chain, right? Notice the collars, notice the hairdo. Everything here could say stems from the dominant culture of wearing dress clothes, but we've adopted those dress clothes to fit our own style and represent our culture. Likewise, take into account acculturation. The dream in the United States in the 50s and 60s was try to own a Chevy or a Cadillac. Chevy or Cadillac was seen as blue-collar, working-class cars that were still luxurious, still beautiful and proud to drive. But if you are just moving to the United States, you wanted the Chevy or the Cadillac, but you represented a class, right, that was not at the same economic status as the middle class or upper class. So you couldn't afford to buy a brand new Chevy or a brand new Cadillac. So what did you do? You took an old car. Maybe it was an old Chevy, maybe it was an old Cadillac, and you slammed it flat on the ground and you put tons of beautiful paint on it, put some new wheels on it, and you adopted this flair that later, like I said, emerged into lowrider culture in order to still have the things that the dominant culture has, but to give it the flair of your own personal cultural background. So these are examples, right, of acculturation and how we've shifted our mindsets over the decades as individuals who have immigrated from other countries have settled here in the United States and held on to parts of their own culture while adopting aspects of the dominant culture. I'd like to share with you really quickly one video, because one of the key components that I noted here regarding acculturation is language. And one of the things I shared was we moved from this notion of assimilation, where we either decided not to speak Spanish entirely, right, in some households, or if you spoke Spanish, to try to avoid having an accent, to where we are today, where Spanish is being spoken throughout the many communities here, particularly in Southern California, even in Northern California. And what we've also said is language is important for us to retain and to teach our children. I want to show you this video. It's a poem in spoken word, which is a really beautiful example of this notion of acculturation in language. When we know and appreciate language and how it connects to our culture, we also recognize that language is connected to our feelings, our thoughts, our perspective of the world. There is an emotional attachment to our language. Our language also shapes our memories, right? Think about, for those of you who grow up in multilingual households, some of the discussions you had with relatives or friends that you love deeply was not necessarily in English, but another language. And so there's an emotional attachment, right, as we acculturate to wanting to hold on to language. Let me show you this video, as it's a beautiful example of this notion of language and the passion behind it. And then we'll commence with our lesson. Let me go ahead and bring up that video here. Okay, and we'll go ahead and get it started.
My mom holds her accent like a shotgun with two good hands. Her tongue all brass knuckled, slipping in between her lips. Her hips are all laughter and wind clap. She speaks a sancocho of Spanish and English pushing up and against one another in rapid fire. See, there is no telling my mama to be quiet. My mama don't know quiet. Her voice is one size better fit all. And you best not tell her to hush. She She waited too many years for her voice to arrive to be told it needed housekeeping. See, English sits in her mouth remixed, so strawberry becomes a strawberry, and cookie becomes a cookie, and kitchen, keychain, and chicken all sound the same. My mother doesn't say yes, she says aha, and suddenly the sky in her mouth becomes a Hector Lavoe song. Her tongue can't lay itself down flat enough for the English language. It got too much hip, too much bone, too much conga, too much cuatro, the two-step, got too many piano keys in between her teeth. It got too much clave, too much hand clap, got too much salsa to sit still. It's being an anxious child, wanting to make Play-Doh out of concrete English, be too neat for her kind of wonderful. Her words spill in conversation between women whose hands are all they got. Sometimes our hands are all we got, and accents that remind us that we are still bomba, still plena. You say huepa, huepa. You say huepa, huepa. And a stranger becomes your hermano. You say dale, dale. And a crowd becomes a family reunion. My mother's tongue is a telegram from her mother decorated with the coquis of El Campo. So even when her lips can barely stretch themselves around English, her accent is a stubborn compass, always pointing her towards home.
All right, I wanted to share this video with you because what a beautiful example, right, of the connection of acculturation, language, emotion, passion of your country of origin, right? Like the artist described in the last few lines of her poem, right? That accent is a stubborn compass, always pointing towards home. So you can have individuals that come to the United States from other countries, and they wish to engage in acculturation rather than assimilation. They're proud to be an American, they want to be an American, and at the same time retain some of the languages, norms, and traditions of their country of origin. So a couple of things for us to consider as social workers are some of the dynamics that are at play related around language. Sometimes you'll see on social media the arguments that ensue out in public when someone may be speaking a language other than English out in public. And sometimes we've seen those reactions of individuals saying, hey, this is the US, you've got to speak English. But another factor to consider is that here in the US, we haven't adopted a national language. And so one thing to think about sometimes when folks are getting worked up with accents, sometimes what we discover is that really there's another source of why they're getting worked up. When you think about why an accent exists in its purest form, it's really just an individual applying the rules from their language of origin to another language, right? You learn how to speak, how to pronounce certain vowels or words, and you take that, let's say from Spanish and what you've learned, and you apply it into English, and there you go, there's your accent. So sometimes what we have to do is begin to educate folks on the notion that an accent isn't just a sound that we make when we speak, right? It's a connection to our identity in a very special way. And so acculturation is an appropriate example to demonstrate that phenomena. So let me go ahead and continue on with the lesson. Now, it's important to understand some immigration terminology. I'm going to move through this very quickly because one of the challenges we also face in current society is that when we talk about immigration, we use some very broad sweeping terms out in media and across the news and just generally in discussions outside of academic discussions. We often refer to all immigrants as aliens or even illegal aliens, and that starts to skew really the nuances that exist of individuals who have moved to the United States for various circumstances. Like I said, that push-pull. When we talk about immigration, it's important for us to have the proper terms dialed in so that we can speak adequately to the specific group that we are addressing or advocating for. So when we use the term alien here in the United States, the legal definition is an individual who is not a US citizen or a US national. If you notice, that's a very broad term. That includes both individuals who are here legally as well as illegally or undocumented. A U.S. national, for example, is an individual who owes his sole allegiance to the U.S., including all U.S. citizens and including some individuals who are not U.S. citizens. So, for tax purposes, under the definition of the IRS, a U.S. national refers to individuals who were born in America Samoa or were born in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands or who have chosen to be U.S. nationals instead of U.S. citizens, okay? Now, some of you are saying citizenship. I understand what that is, but a U.S. citizen under governmental definition is an individual born in the U.S., an individual whose parent is a U.S. citizen, and a former alien who has been naturalized in the U.S., who's become a United States citizen after they moved here, an individual born in Puerto Rico or Guam, or an individual born in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So it's important for us to understand the nuances of the language so we know how to speak adequately on this topic. Now, let's move into just a couple more definitions regarding immigration. So an immigrant. So you notice we had the language of alien, and now we're going into immigrant. An alien is an individual who has been granted the right by the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services to live permanently in the United States and to work without restrictions in the U.S. So such an individual is also known as a lawful permanent resident, and all immigrants are eventually issued a green card, is what we'll call it, right? Which is evidence of the alien's legal permanent resident status. So individuals can come here for different purposes legally and be considered an immigrant to the United States. Sometimes we have students that are coming and studying from abroad and they're here to study, so they would be considered an immigrant who's here on some sort of visa allowing them to study. Other individuals may travel to other countries like the United States for work, for their job, and they can be here legally under this documentation to serve in that way. So we can have immigrants that are here legally, and we can have also what are referred to as undocumented aliens that are under certain different circumstances. So here in the US, and this is what most of the hype around the topic of immigration is addressing, but you notice that oftentimes you'll hear like illegal alien or just aliens broadly referred to, and that really starts to group individuals into a false sort of cognitive framework of understanding the nuances of the circumstances in which people come to this country. So an undocumented alien is an alien who entered the United States illegally without proper authorization or documents. They cross the border, they enter, right? And the US government was not made aware, nor any paperwork was involved in that crossing. Or they entered the United States legally and had overstayed their visa, right? So their visa expired, they stayed, and as a result, now their status has changed from immigrant to undocumented alien. And an undocumented alien is deported if apprehended, right? Which is what we're seeing a lot of the times now in current policy. One last term that I want to throw your way is refugee status. And so you often hear the term immigrants and refugees, and some of us may say, well, what are the nuances between the two? Refugee status, or asylum as we call it, may be granted to people who have been persecuted or fear they will be persecuted on account of race, religion, nationality, or a membership in a particular social or political opinion or group. So here's something to consider around refugees. Remember, we talked about the push-pull effect. Refugees are often being pushed from their country of origin and pulled to another country due to violence, war, famine, or persecution for the reasons outlined here, right, per the government's definition. Now, the important thing to consider is you may only seek a referral for refugee status from outside the United States. This complicates things further. So individuals may choose to flee their country of origin because of the issues that are going on in that country. But if they've not filed for refugee status before arriving to the United States, that does create challenges, right? And in order to claim asylum, asylum status is a form of protection for people who meet the definition located here above, are already in the United States, are seeking admission to a port of entry, meaning they have to come into a specific port of entry in the United States rather than just crossing any border. And you can apply for asylum status in the US regardless of your country of origin or current immigration status. It's important to note that refugee status is not as easy to establish as we may think, and actually only a small number, a tiny percentage, of individuals who immigrate to the United States actually claim refugee status due to the legal guidelines. In fact, let me go ahead and provide you with some data now. So the reason I want to provide data to this is to really give us a global perspective on, on the discussions around immigration. And the reason for this is because oftentimes here in the US, we discuss immigration naturally as it impacts the United States, but we're really only talking about a specific group of individuals, which relatively is a small percentage, which I'm going to show you in a second. And we're really only discussing one class of individuals, where are those undocumented undocumented aliens, okay? And so I want to give you a breakdown really quickly of what it looks like based on citizenship status here in the US. Native-born citizens really make up about 86% of the total population in the US, to the tune of about 278.8 million individuals. When we talk about naturalized citizens, these are individuals who immigrated to the United States and then became US citizens through naturalization, is only about 6% of the total population. When we talk about legal non-citizens, individuals here studying for work or for studying for school or going to work, we're discussing 13.1 million individuals, which is only 4% of the population. Now, when we talk about, let's skip down to temporary visas. These are individuals who just have that temporary visa. They're here in the US for a short period of time, and then they return to their country of origin. That's 1.7 million people. That's less than 1% of the population. And when you think about the notion then that unauthorized immigrants, what's estimated is about 11.3 million people exist here in the United States. When you factor in the total US population of 322 million, that makes up only 3% of the total population. Why is this important for us to understand as social workers? From a macro perspective, a lot of the discussions, sometimes the argument, the fear, the anger, right, that exists in our society, the polarity within our society, when we quantify the number, we're only talking about 3% of the population. Yet so much of our discourse, our policies, the relationships that are broken right at the dinner table as a result of this discussion, it's really only impacting 3% of our total population. Something for us to think about, right, when we engage in discussions around immigration. Now, where are individuals coming from that immigrate to the United States? Well, I'd like to point out there's a lot of numbers here, but I'd like us to point out that this tracks immigration patterns by regions of the world since 1960 up to 2015. And what we see are the numbers. Let's look at the bottom numbers here, and let's skip this column in red for a second. From South or East Asia, we've got 12.1 million individuals, right, coming to the United States over this period of 1960 to 2015. From Mexico, very close number here, 11.6 million people. From the Caribbean, 4 million. From Central America, 3.3. South America, 2.9. The Middle East, 1.2. And Sub-Saharan Africa, 1.7 million people. Let me acknowledge the pattern that we're seeing here globally. In all of these columns with the black, what we have seen is an increase in the number of individuals immigrating to the United States from 1960 to 2015, except in one area of the world. If you look at Europe and Canada, we've actually seen the reverse occur. We've seen less individuals immigrating to the United States, dropping by approximately 3 million, almost 3 million, here in that same time period. What does this tell us, this data, as social workers that we want to be attuned to? Well, oftentimes the topic of immigration is proposed as or discussed as a Mexico problem, right? To say the issue is that Mexican immigrants are crossing the border and that is inundating the United States and our infrastructure. I won't debate that the number of individuals from Mexico is very high. We see the data here to support this. I will also not debate that it can cause a strain on our economic system, healthcare system, housing market, all of these other things. That is true. But when we only paint the picture as an issue solely with Mexico, we're actually skipping a larger discussion entirely. What we're actually seeing is a global pattern of individuals from all parts of the world who are immigrating to the United States under that push-pull phenomena because they are either being run from their countries of origin due to war, famine, genocide, discrimination, whatever the case is, and they're coming to the United States for that security, for that safety, for those opportunities. And what we see is countries with similar economics, opportunities, or whatever the case is, what we see is they're staying where they are. In fact, they're coming to the United States less. What do we want to derive from the issue, this data related to the topic of immigration? Immigration not solely an issue impacting the United States. When other countries are losing citizens and they're coming to the United States, that impacts those countries as well. It impacts their economics. It impacts their family dynamics. More so, what we also want to understand is as social workers adopting a global perspective, is that what we'll want to be able to do is shift and begin to examine what is going on in all of these other countries. Where can there be assistance from social workers, maybe from other countries partnering, like the US, to help to solve some of these social problems that may exist in these countries in order for individuals to feel less pushed from their countries of origin and to stay, right? And so this is the discussion that is often missing from a lot of the discourse related to immigration at the moment. Another discussion that we often forget about, particularly here in Southern California, sometimes we'll have individuals say, well, you know what, the immigrant population here in the United States, and particularly in Southern California, is so very high and it's so concentrated. But we forget that there was actually agreements that were put in place by the federal government which encouraged and increased the presence of immigrants here in Southern California. One of those in particular is called the Bracero program. Or as many of you will be referred to as the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement between the United States government and Mexico. So all of these photos I just want to share also come from Riverside, California, from the Casablanca community. And they provided these to us as well as really a historical archive of some of the history in Casablanca and in Southern California. So many of you may know that here in Southern California, in Riverside, Orange County, Redlands, Rialto, that much of Southern California before it was industrialized was agricultural, right? We had huge citrus crops of oranges that we shipped across the United States via train. And during World War II, this is when the Bracero program first came into effect in August 4th, 1942. We were involved in gearing up, right, for World War II. And as a result of that, both men and women were sent off to participate in the war effort, right, to help build war equipment or for soldiers to serve overseas. And what that left was less individuals here in the United States that were available to harvest and grow crops that needed to keep the economy running. And so the Bracero movement was implemented. Now, Bracero, it refers to the word brazo, which means arm in Spanish. And when we say someone is a bracero, what we're saying is it's a person who works with their hands, with their arms, a manual laborer, okay? And so in 1942, the US government signed the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement with the United States. And subsequently, over 22 years since that agreement took place, over 4.6 million labor contracts were authorized permitting legal entry of Mexican citizens to provide agricultural labor here in Southern California, including in Riverside, right down the street from our campus. This is a picture of the Victoria Packing House in 1950 under the Bracero program, where many of the women worked in the packing house, packing up all of the crops of the oranges, and the men mostly worked in the fields, picking and harvesting those crops. It's important also to note that when we say that 4.6 million individual labor contracts were signed, that means with an individual person. So over 22 years, 4.6 million individuals traveled to Southern California from Mexico to seek work in the Bracero movement. The Bracero movement was later terminated in 1964, okay? And as a result of that, what we saw was that many individuals who moved to the US for work here in Riverside and Casablanca, well, what happened? They moved here looking for work. Maybe one of these gentlemen met one of these ladies. They decided to stay, have a family, and live in Riverside. And so part of our history and why we see an increase, right, in the notion of movement between countries was not only simply because of the push-pull effect, as a result of genocide or war or famine, but also the pull effect through legal agreements between governments. In particular, in this case, the US government saying we need more immigrant labor in order to support our economy during this time. Now, it's important to note that while all this was going on in this period of 22 years, there were other movements that were at play here in Southern California. During this time, a lot of people nowadays tend to think of California as, sometimes what's described by others as a liberal space or an accepting place for immigrants or individuals who are different, come from different countries. But what we also forget is even here in Southern California during the civil rights era, there was different forms of discrimination that existed towards these individuals that we see in these photos. During the same time when the Bracero movement was going within the state of California, if you were Mexican, Chinese, or Native American, you were not allowed within certain public settings such as restaurants or stores. Our own form of segregation occurred here, even in Riverside, San Bernardino, Rialto, like all these other areas of Southern California. In fact, signs were posted banning dogs and Mexicans, and Mexican Mondays were implemented within some public parks and pools. And what would happen is that Mondays, if you were Mexican, were the only days that you could swim in Riverside. That day was actually Tuesday. So let's say you're in Riverside. If you're a Mexican, you could swim on Tuesdays. What would happen is at the end of the day, the pool would be drained, cleaned, refilled, and then the rest of the week was open. If you are a white citizen, you could swim, okay, in the pool in Riverside the rest of the week. In addition to that, discrimination via the public school system was also present here, where students that were in Casablanca actually went to school in Casablanca. They were segregated from other schools in Riverside. And later, when desegregation started to come into place, they were eventually combined into one school. So we forget about some of this history of immigration that helps paint a picture of some of the experiences of individuals who immigrated from other countries, in this case, Mexico, to the United States. So, where are we at in terms of policy related to immigration enforcement? Well, something to consider is that policy in how we enforce immigration here in the United States has shifted dramatically over the past few decades. In fact, the way that we implement immigration policy now, how we choose to utilize the border, detain at the border, all of these other things look very different than they did back in the 60s and 70s. So back in the day, in the late 1960s and 70s, what we saw was Border Patrol actually waited for individuals to cross the US border into a US border town. And when they did that, those individuals crossed, they were detained by Border Patrol, okay? And then they were sent back, right? Returned to their countries of origin. This policy by the US government was referred to as show of force, right? So we are present at the border. We show that we are here. We're going to wait for you to cross. And once you cross, then border policy will be implemented. But that's actually not how we manage the border now. Through several policy shifts over the decade within several states and the federal level, what we've seen is differences in how we enforce immigration policy now. So in the 1990s is when we really started to see a shift in border policy and how we implemented those policies. The southern border states in particular, like California, Arizona, and Texas, started to implement their own policies to shift detainments away from border towns and to do it earlier in the desert, okay? So we didn't wait for individuals to jump the fence or to hop a gate, right, and then enter into a US border town. We started to move that away and detain earlier in the desert aspect of the United States. The policies for this in California was named Operation Gatekeeper, which was implemented in 1994. In Arizona, they had Operation Safeguard, which was implemented in 94 and 99. And in Texas, they referred to it as Operation Rio Grande in 1997. So individuals, rather than be detained in towns, were now detained in the desert on the US side. And they were referred to, and this is an issue that created a challenge for us, because in the United States, what we started to see was if individuals weren't crossing over into the towns and they were being detained out in the desert, it was sort of an out of sight, out of mind approach. We didn't see the detainments happening. We didn't see the efforts of immigration of individuals coming in. And so we started to think to ourselves, that's a distant problem, right? We don't need to become necessarily as concerned or involved in it. And so this was because crossing, detainments, interactions with agents were not as visible. Now, at the federal level, what happened is 1993, our policy shifted And we adopted this new era of immigration border policy called protection through deterrence. There were several factors that we started to experience in this time in the 90s going into the early 2000s that shifted the way that we monitored, detained, and interacted with individuals in the desert, in the border, okay? Now, in 1993, the US launched Operation Blockade. During this operation, federal officers and helicopters were deployed to intercept individuals in the desert prior to reaching border towns. So now we weren't just sending trucks out into the desert. We're also launching increased number of federal officers, helicopters, and other equipment. And the goal of the US government was to decrease the number of crossing attempts by using the Sonora Desert as its natural border. So the US government noticed, they said, hey, we've got the border towns, but the desert is pretty unrelenting as well. And if we're able to apprehend individuals in the desert, then what we can do is use the desert as its own natural barrier to try to deter individuals from crossing the border because of its harsh conditions. In addition to this policy, post 9/11, after September 11th, what we also saw was federal funding intensified for US Border Patrol, which further militarized border agents. That's when they got all of the new goods, right? The infrared, detection systems, the off-road vehicles, the firearms, like, and all of the other things. And so what we saw was this transformation over the decades to militarizing the border and using the Sonora Desert as its own barrier to attempt to deter individuals from crossing. When I say that we use the Sonora Desert, I don't say that lightly, right? There's a couple of things to consider about the harshness of the Sonora Desert. Why we want to be attuned to this as social workers is because at some point in your career, you may find yourself working with refugees or immigrants who attempted to cross the border. And as a result, there was either physical, emotional trauma that took place as a result of that. The Sonora Desert is in fact considered one of the most inhospitable, harsh, or hostile deserts by archaeologists. It consists of mountains, valleys, rivers, and wide stretches of desert. And temperatures in the Sonora Desert can range from sub-zero to 118 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperatures can also drop 50 degrees Fahrenheit in a matter of minutes. So think about this for a second, right? It's one of the hottest North American deserts. And in addition to the desert itself being inhospitable, you also have other elements like animals, bobcats, coyotes, javelinas, which are kind of these like warthog looking figures right here, and rattlesnakes are indigenous to the region. So the US government caught on to something and they said to themselves, if we use the desert and all of these factors here, this will either one, deter people from entering the US because they don't want to deal with it. But what we also noticed was there were severe consequences for those that tried. In fact, what we saw was an increase in recorded migrant deaths at the border in the Sonora Desert. All of these red dots represent recorded deaths, basically remains that were left in the desert in an attempt to cross over into the United States. So factors like dehydration, starvation, sexual assault, individuals just getting lost in this inhospitable environment, organized crime, no emergency response, at least quick response for medical incidents, individuals left behind, or deaths that were unreported exist out here in the desert as a result of this shift of protection through deterrence policy. As social workers, one of the things we have to consider is honoring the dignity of every human being, right? And when we shift our policies to force individuals to take these routes, we know that they're coming for the push-pull effect. But when we say that the path to take in order to enter the United States is this treacherous path that can ultimately take your life and has taken thousands of individuals' lives, these are just the ones that were recorded and reported, right? There's many more that are probably out there that we don't know about. Then there are ethical considerations for us to consider as social workers. In the midst of that, policy still continued to remain through protection through deterrence. And there's a couple of pieces of evidence that actually lead us to believe that the US government has been knowledgeable of the deaths and the harsh conditions that have occurred in the Sonora Desert as a result of this shift in policy. In fact, in 1997, there was a report by the Government Accountability Office that identified as one indicator of measuring the effectiveness of protection through deterrence was the deaths of aliens attempting entry. The report states that the predicated outcomes of the Attorney General's strategy was successful. So this is a disturbing piece to read, right? But the reality is that if individuals die crossing the border, there's less individuals entering into the United States. Something very sobering for us to think about. In 2010, a report to Congress read that prevention through deterrence has pushed unauthorized migration away from the population centers and funneled it into more remote and hazardous border regions. This policy has had the unintended consequences of increasing the number of fatalities along the border as unauthorized migrants attempt to cross over the inhospitable Arizona desert without adequate supplies of water. And this was back in 2010. And as I've shared with you, we're here in the years that we are today, and this policy is still in effect. As social workers with a global mindset, what we want to do is pull from this lecture. Individuals are traveling from all parts of the world due to the push-pull effect. They're entering and crossing the US border through Mexico because this is an available border to enter into the US. And in doing so, they are literally taking their life in their hands, navigating the Sonora Desert in order to try to seek a better life for themselves and for their families. So what are the spiritual implications, right, for us to consider related to serving undocumented individuals? One piece is to consider, as we see in Matthew, right, that Jesus and his family were refugees. Jesus fled political persecution. Joseph and Mary fled political persecution, right, when Mary was pregnant. She fled to Bethlehem, and there, when they were in Bethlehem, Jesus was born. It's also important to note that when Jesus was born, this king that was going to save us from our sins, right, was not born in a temple. He wasn't born in a fort. He wasn't born in a castle. He was born in poverty. Jesus' family were not only refugees, when Mary gave birth, they were homeless. Jesus was born in a manger, in a barn with other animals. And I don't know if you've been to a barn or smelled a barn, right? But it's not a pleasant experience. And so he was born in a manger, in poverty, as a refugee. Jesus, the first announcement of the arrival of our King, right, was not to those in power. It wasn't to the federal government. It wasn't to an army or a military or militia. Jesus' first announcement through the angels, right, came to shepherds, shepherds in a field at night. Shepherds in a field were seen sort of as outcasts. They were a little out there because they were spending all this time outdoors with all these smelly animals. And so for the most part, much of society marginalized shepherds and kind of pushed them to the outskirts. What's important to recognize is Jesus saw value, God saw value in communicating the birth of our Lord and Savior to those who were on the margins. And finally, Jesus claimed, all right, and tasked us with the notion of social responsibility. In Matthew 25, right, and this is what aligns well with our social work practice, when Jesus says, you know, truly I say to you, as what you did to the least of these, you did unto me, Jesus is reminding us that whatever we do in the service of God to others, we are also doing to Christ. But what we also want to consider is whatever we do to neglect the human dignity, the existence of others, we are neglecting the dignity of Christ. And so there are some really applicable spiritual implications for us to consider related to serving individuals without citizenship. Most importantly, being Jesus and his family were without citizenship. They were born into poverty. They announced the coming of the King to those on the margins, and Jesus called for us to serve those on the margins, right, in service to him. I want to leave us with this quote as we prepare to end our lecture for today. Dr. King had stated that one has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree, right, with St. Augustine, who said an unjust law is no law at all. Why is that important for us to know? Well, our code of ethics for our National Association of Social Workers calls for us to engage in work, right, to act, to prevent and eliminate the domination, exploitation, and discrimination against any person, group, or class on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, color, sex, sexual orientation, gender, identity or expression, age, marital status, political belief, religion, immigration status. You see it here. And so what is important for us to represent or to understand is that not only is it our spiritual calling to serve individuals without citizenship, to address the global dynamics at play in the push-pull phenomena, and to still honor and recognize the dignity in all individuals, but also it is part of our ethical obligation as social workers to do so. Folks, I want to thank you so much for joining me for today's lecture. And I want to go ahead and close us out with our centering activity for today. And that will come to us our scripture from Psalm 133, verse 1. How good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity. So rather than look at us as citizen, non-citizen, immigrant, alien, whatever the case is, we are all children of God. We are all created in God's image. And our duty as Christian social workers is to go forth and promote unity and honoring the dignity of every individual. So let's go ahead and put our hands and feet in a nice comfortable position. Let's go ahead and take that nice deep breath and exhale. And as we take another nice deep breath, let's close our eyes and let's draw in to God's presence in this very moment. He is here with you in the room right now. And dwell on the scripture verse that says how good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity. We'll come back just in a couple of minutes. All right, let's go ahead and take a nice deep breath and come back and open your eyes. Folks, I want to thank you for engaging in another lecture. I hope you found the information useful for you. Please reach out if you have any questions, thoughts, or you just like to connect with me. It's always a pleasure to do that with you. I wish you all the very best this week. Thank you all. God bless.